is Amy, and I am a full-time missionary to Colombia, South America. I've actually been here for almost 30 years now. If you've been watching the news at all last week and this week, you know that on August the 10th, Colombia had a 7.4 magnitude earthquake in the western part of the country that is the strongest earthquake that this country has experienced for a century. And the destruction has been absolutely heartbreaking. I want to talk to you about what it's been like for the people living here. And is Colombia prepared for something like this, for this tragedy that happened last week? And my answer is what my answer would probably be in any nation is yes and no. In some ways, Colombia actually is very prepared for this. There are highly trained rescue teams, firefighters, police and military personnel, medical teams, volunteers, and organizations that know how to respond when disaster strikes. And I have seen this response happening every day since August the 10th. In Cali, rescue teams and civilians work together to search collapsed buildings, even literally using their bare hands. And at least 37 people were rescued from 40 collapsed buildings during the early rescue efforts. And some of the stories coming out of Colombia, they're just hard to listen to, and they have just broken my heart. I could sit here all day today and tell you story after story, some of them tragic, some of them miraculous. One of them is a story about Anna Maria, who was a 23-year-old girl living in Cali, Colombia. Anna Maria was one of triplet sisters when the building that her and her family lived in collapsed. Her parents and both of her sisters died in the earthquake. Anna Maria survived because a door fell over her and shielded her from the debris. She was eventually rescued and taken to the hospital. And then you've got stories on the other side of that tragedy that are simply miraculous. A 6-month-old baby was pulled alive from the rubble of a collapsed building also in Cali. Rescuers heard that there was a baby underneath the debris, and the people worked together to get the child out. The baby survived, as did the mother. And there have been other rescues that honestly are nothing more than and nothing less than miraculous. People being found alive after hours or days underneath the rubble. People hearing a voice underneath the debris and refusing to stop digging. People who could have walked away, but they didn't. And that's one of the things that has struck me so much and so deeply this week. The way people have responded. Colombians show up for one another. That is one of their major strengths in this culture. And I think that it's something that you see in Colombia over and over again. When people are hurting, Colombians show up. And maybe that is part of also what it means to be prepared. Not just to have the right equipment or not to have the right emergency plans in place, but having people who are willing to stay and to say, I am not leaving you here by yourself. And that's another reason I've been thinking so much about what has happened this week. When I came here in 1995, I immediately began to hear prophetic words being prophesied over Colombia, about how God was going to move over this nation, about how God is going to move over the city of Ibagué where I live. I have heard those prophecies. I've even given the prophecies of a move of God over this nation, because if you come to Colombia, you will feel it in the atmosphere. It is like something is getting ready to happen in a good way. And I've carried those words and carried that feeling and that knowing in my heart and my spirit for decades now. And I think that that's been one of the reasons why it's given me the strength to stay here in Colombia in seasons where it's been very difficult. And I can't even put into words or describe to you how difficult it has been at times to stay here. There have been times when I wondered if it was time to go, times when it would have been so much easier to walk away, times when I've just wanted to run and escape and just go back to what I would say was a normal life. But I've never been what some people describe as released to leave this nation. Um, Through it all, I absolutely believe that God is not finished with Colombia. I believe with my whole heart that Colombia is on the cusp of great things. When you've carried something like that in your heart for so many years, you can't help but pay attention when you begin to see things happening that make you wonder if something is shifting. On August 7th, Colombia experienced a major political transition, another miraculous move in Colombia. The current president that took his place on August the 7th, won by, I believe it was less than 1%. And with the new president being sworn into office and 3 days later, the earthquake striking, it makes you pay attention. It makes you open your eyes to that maybe that there are other things that are happening in the spirit realm that we're absolutely not seeing with our physical eyes yet. And I believe that some of the spiritual darkness that has covered this nation is beginning to lift. You can feel it. It's lifting. And I don't say that because everything around us here in Colombia looks perfect right now. Actually, it is quite the opposite. Sometimes the greatest spiritual shifts don't happen when everything looks peaceful. I think we wait for everything to seem to be peaceful before we believe that God can move or shift spiritually over our lives. A lot of times, those shifts happen right in the middle of the shaking. So, what do you do when everything around you is shaking? That's not just a question for an earthquake that happened in Colombia or anywhere else in the world. That is a question for all of us in life. What do you do when your life suddenly changes? When you do not understand what God is doing? We've all been there. We're all there probably quite often over the last few years with everything that's been happening in the world. Psalm 23, you probably know it by heart. You might be even reciting it in your mind as you heard the scripture reference. But in Psalms 23, verse 5, David says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." How many times have you read that verse? How many times have you quoted that verse? Have you ever wondered what was on that table? We talk a lot about the enemies surrounding David at that time. We talk a lot about the battle and walking in that valley. And David says that God prepared a table. God didn't prepare a table when his enemies left or when his enemies disappeared. He prepared the table in the presence of his enemies. The enemies were still there. The valley was still there. The battle was still there. And yet David sat down. Think about that. Sitting down is an act of trust. If you're in the middle of a battle with your enemies surrounding you, you are constantly aware and looking over your shoulder. You're not sitting down at a table. But when you sit down at a table, you're saying, I trust the one who prepared this table. I don't have to fight every battle by myself. I don't have to spend my life looking over my shoulder because I know who is taking care of me. We believe that victory means that the enemy has to disappear. And we think that peace means that the storm has to stop. That we're going to experience victory once the trial is over. But Psalms 23 shows us something completely different. And if I ask myself, and I have wondered what was on that table, I think on that table that there was victory, there was peace, there was trust, there was hope, there was a stability that David could experience as he sat down at the table with the one who gives us supernatural peace when the enemy is still standing right there in front of us. God gives you victory in the middle of the valley. You don't have to come out of the valley to have victory. The table is prepared before the battle is over. We don't know when life is going to change. We don't know what's coming next. But we do know who we serve. And we need to sit down at the table that God has prepared for us. Trust God with what is happening around you right now. To say to Him, Lord, I trust you with all of these things that I don't understand today. I trust you with what I can't see. And when you know the one who prepared the table, you don't have to wait for the valley to end before you experience peace and before you experience victory. You don't have to wait for every enemy to disappear before you know that God is bringing you into greater things, into a shifting in your spiritual atmosphere. You don't have to have every answer before you can keep walking. And I'm not going to wait for the absence of my enemies to trust in the presence of my shepherd. I'm going to sit down at that table today because I know who prepared that table. And I know that there's every good thing on that table before me today in the presence of my enemy. And I know that a lot of you have a lot of enemies that are surrounding you today. Maybe it's in your mind, or maybe it's just in your circumstances. But sit down today. Sit down at the table. Sit down at the table, and you can sit down with your shepherd today, with the table that he has prepared for you, because he's the one that knows how it's all going to end. He's not worried that the enemies are surrounding. He doesn't have to worry. He always has the last word. Thank you again for watching today. I hope that you keep seeking. I hope that you stay ready, and I will see you next week.